Oligopolies, assessed very regularly, lots of content to learn, and just like the other market structures, let's start with the characteristics. When I sat my A-levels, one of the best ways I remembered oligopolies is using the Coke versus Pepsi example. Try think about the market structure they would occupy and what their likely characteristics are. So, firstly, oligopolistic markets usually have a few large sellers. This means there is a very small number of sellers which have a very high concentration ratio or a very high market share, and due to this they occupy significant monopoly power. Secondly, high barriers to entry/exit, and this works hand in hand with the first characteristic, as the reason why there are only a few large sellers is that the high barriers to entry makes it near impossible for new firms to enter the market. Thirdly, differentiated goods. Lastly, and one of the main key terms you will constantly be hearing, is interdependence. The way I would define this is how one firm's decision directly affects other firms. Now, as you know, to score those top marks in your essay, you need to have an appreciation of real-world economics. So knowing examples of oligopolies is doing just that. Now, let's think about oligopolies examples in the UK, and one of the biggest ones would be UK broadband. And relating back to the first characteristic, when we talk about few large sellers, that relates directly to those few large sellers having a high concentration ratio. So if you're ever talking about the characteristics, you can use this example. For example, BT, Virgin Media, Sky and TalkTalk have a 4-firm concentration ratio of 86%. So these 4 largest firms essentially dominate the entire market. Now, another good example from across the pond, so the US, would be Coca-Cola and Pepsi. These firms have a 96% 2-firm concentration ratio in the soft drinks industry. Now, in your essays, you may be asked to explain the features of oligopolies, so here, let's go a bit more in depth with the individual features, and I'll give you the logical, accurate chains of analysis. So, like I said, when explaining oligopolies, it makes it a lot easier to work in the Coke versus Pepsi example. For example, the first one, few large sellers, then you can quote the concentration ratio of 96%. Then secondly, high barriers to entry and exit. Now, we've learned quite a few barriers to entry, but let's take the example of brand loyalty. So Coke and Pepsi, as you'll know, have very high brand loyalty. Therefore, how does that affect new firms entering the market? It means that it makes it almost impossible for a new firm without any reputation to make any sales because of Coke and Pepsi's branding is so strong. Now, still using the Coke and Pepsi example, differentiated goods. As you know, Coke and Pepsi are very similar, but they're definitely not the same, so they taste slightly different. Lastly, interdependence. So the way we've defined this is one firm's decisions directly affect another firm. Now, what's one of the biggest decisions a firm has to make? Now, let's think back to the classical economic assumption. Firms are profit maximizers. Therefore, one of the biggest decisions firms make is price and how they are going to set their price. Now, the way I would explain interdependence is using this example. So, an American oligopolistic domestic airline industry, which included 4 of the biggest airlines, was found that if one airline raised their price 5% on a route, there was a 90% probability that competitor firms did too. This almost perfectly fits our definition, as our definition is one firm's decisions, and this is one airline has decided to raise their price, and it has directly affected the other firms. How has it directly affected the other firms? Because the competitor firms have also decided to increase prices.